I was going to do another video which is more technical one next, but it turns out this is going to be the last day of good weather we have for a good long while. Of course, Wales is always like this, but not for the next couple of weeks apparently. So I thought I'd come out here and do something a little bit different and go back to a site that I told you about last year. Because somewhere around here there is a place with crinoids. So it's taken a couple of miles walking across the common to get to this stream gully that we have here, which has some very interesting fossils in. At least that's the idea. So I wanted to show you how we go about looking at a new site, how we work out what we've got, try to interpret it, and how we find and wrap fossils. So this is going to be a bit of an exploratory one, because I've been here once before on pretty horrible weather, and this could be better than I've seen it before. Who knows what is going to turn up? The first stop is this set of slabs here, which we found last time and turned out to be quite interesting. So the first thing you can see is it's quite finely layered. There are multiple sort of thin plates there, about 5mm thick. But when you look at the surfaces, they're also covered in fossils. So let's have a little look. And all those lines on the surfaces are graptolites. Hundreds and hundreds of graptolites. Which is really rather handy, because graptolites are a thing that you can use to work out the age. So in this case, they are at first glance monograptids, and they've got a single branch with a little the teeth on one side, and we can probably do a little better than that. In fact, if you happen to live with a graptolite specialist, she'll tell you exactly what they are. Oi, Lucy, what's this then?
So, it's a rock.
Graptolites.
Oh, right. Graptis Chimera.
That'll do nicely. Age?
Are these Ludlow?
That'll do. Thank you. There's a few things you can say about this immediately. First thing is, this plane here is covered in graptolites, and this one isn't. Now that's quite interesting in itself. But first off, we need to go back a step, don't we? Because where do graptolites live? In the sea, obviously. Well, obviously if you know what graptolites are. If you don't, they're little planktonic marine animals, little colonies, so each of those would add 20 or 30 little animals in. And they were floating around in the surface oceans. We've never found them in fresh water. It doesn't seem that their biology could cope with that. So you know as soon as you see graptolites that this was in the sea. Now, quite often people think of layers of sediment as being pretty much the same, but as soon as you start looking at in geology and in any detail, you realise that there's a lot of variation. So this plane here is covered in graptolites which are mostly aligned, not perfectly. I mean, there are sort of sways of them going this way, going that way. They're all sort of a little bit jumbled, but there are definite bands of graptolites going in various orientations, mostly in that sort of direction. So what does that mean? Well, graptolites are not orienting themselves that way. This is what happens when the little skeletons of the colonies sink down to the seafloor and there's a current. So because these are basically sawtooth sticks with holes going in one direction, they are oriented by the current in a certain direction, because just like washing water over matchsticks, they'll line up in that direction. So we know that there was a slightly irregular current, as it turns out, going more or less that way or that way. Now, if you look very carefully and look at the direction the sawteeth are pointing in, sometimes you get an indication of which of those two options it was. And in this case, it's a little bit mixed, but most of them seem to be oriented with the teeth opening in that direction. which means that there was a water flow going that way. And the sun is over there, so that'll be more or less south at the moment, slightly west to south. So that is approximately a current coming from the south, which was concentrating these graptolites. Now, they must have been a large number of graptolites there, because we're seeing them on one plane, but these would also have been winnowed. They would have been through a thickness of sediment or length of time, and then they've been concentrated in this one layer by the currents. But then you look at these other layers above them, just a few millimeters thick of this sort of silty material, and what you find there is lots of graptolites in some places, no graptolites in others. And in some places they are arranged completely randomly. That is what you'd expect, these graptolites going all over the place, where they're sinking down from the sea surface, and there are no currents orienting them. So in this case, the graptolites are basically just settling out of the water and onto a still sea floor. And in other times, there are hardly any graptolites at all. So some of these upper layers here, there's one graptolite there, another there, but you have to look to find them. They're not everywhere. So there's variations in the ecology here. We've got graptolites living at different abundances, possibly because of there being different times of year. It may be that this surface represents the summer or the late summer, when they've all sort of multiplied and produced large numbers of colonies, and then there was a mass die-off, and that's what we're seeing here. Whereas this is winter, when there wasn't much of them. Do we know any more than that? Let's have a little look in the side view. And you can normally, if you just break these rocks open a bit, see if there are any very fine layers within the rock. And those fine layers are there. Yes, I can see that. On less than a millimetre scale, there are variations in the colour, the lightness and darkness of the rock, and on the sediment type, the coarseness of the sediment. So that means that it's not that this is summer and this is winter. These are separated by quite a lot of time. Probably based on that, if we assume those are annual cycles, which they probably are, because we're seeing a regular change between coarser and finer, lighter and darker sediment on a fairly regular sort of interval. That is normally what you get with seasonality. You're looking at probably 2 or 3 years per millimetre, so that interval there is maybe 15 or 20 years between these two surfaces. You often think of geology as taking millions of years for things to get laid down, and sometimes that's true. But in general, sediment gets laid down a lot quicker than that. So when you're looking at a rock sequence like this, and you are aware that the hills around us are made of more or less the same age of sediment. This is Silurian rock, as are the Radnor Forest, great big rounded hills over there. And some of these are going into the late Ordovician, but this is 2 or 3 kilometres of early middled Silurian rock. So when you're looking on a scale of a centimetre, that's not going to be a very long time, because a Silurian isn't very long. It's only, what, 20 million years? Only. So when you do the sort of multiplications or the divisions of that interval, that thickness, what you end up with is quite short intervals of time, represented by thin intervals of rock. So that's not a bad start, given we haven't really started yet. This is just the first slabs that we look at. I wonder what else there is here. Well, that's where we were looking just now, those slabs up where my bag is, but that's just one little outcrop on the side of this stream. You can see there's a bit more to the left there, and if we come around here, it's a rather lovely little stream valley, if slightly densely inhabited by sheep. Then you start to find that there's more little outcrops on the side here. And these ones we can have a good close look at, hopefully, and see what variation there is here, because now we're not seeing the surface of the slabs, we're seeing the sides of them. And based on the angles that we're seeing here, that should be slightly above the layers that we have there. So you follow the dip of those beds down into the ground. The layers over here are a little bit above them, which means that these beds are younger. And occasionally rocks are upside down, but not in this case. Okay, I think that's us sorted to start with. So we have a nice hard rock from the stream to use as an anvil. We have an outcrop. We have some paper to put things on so we don't lose them. And we got some boxes and tissues for wrapping material, and we just found a thistle to put our arm on. Just what you want. So let's have a little look. And one could use chisels and things for this as well. But first of all, just get a little bit out. And there's not much in there at first glance. It's very, it's not laminated. This is a layer of pale brown grey sediment, siltstone by the looks of it. Splits a bit more nicely. Okay, there are some layers in here as well, but not many. This is pretty much pure unfossiliferous siltstone. And sometimes that is what you'll get. There will be layers that are exactly like that, that there's just no fossils in there. Maybe because this isn't laminated, this was an event bed, a flow of sediment that came down from shallower water, sort of slumping down the sea, over the sea floor, and didn't contain much in it. Or maybe it was a time when there weren't enough nutrients to support lots of graptolites, and so you just don't see much. Sometimes I actually start getting excited when we don't find much in the way of fossils, because it normally means that when you do find something, it's going to be a lot better. That's because most of the very fossil-rich deposits that you hear about, limestones and so on, where you can just go and every rock that you pick up is full of fossils, most of those are concentrations. They have been washed around for a long time on the seafloor. You've got bits, fragments of all sorts of gubbins, random stuff, but nothing is exceptionally preserved because they have all been washed around and concentrated. You're not seeing anything shortly after it was alive. Whereas if you get a sudden deposit of sediment, there might be almost nothing in it, but when you do find it, it might be exceptional. So one doesn't give up on that sort of thing. It's a bit disappointing when you first start looking. But that was one layer, and we know it varies a lot from one layer to the next. So let's have a look at the next one. I should have brought chisels today. Normally you don't need them around here, but today it would have been handy. Okay, that also has nothing much in it but some spectacular laminations. So that really does highlight that there are changes from one bedding plane to the next, darker and lighter. Yeah, so that isn't a single event. That is lots of years probably in that short interval there. So I'm just going to try to split a bit of that because probably there will be some fossils in there. Sometimes splitting a rock with the sharp end of your hammer is the way to go, and other times that just doesn't work. And you need to wallop it with a blunt end and then force it to split, which is what's happening here. And again, there's nothing there. Well, what a surprise. One of the first things to learn about fossil hunting is that you need quite a bit of patience. Sometimes you go out and you find nothing at all. But usually not if you've gone to the right place. But nothing in that layer. So you just carry on going down, seeing what you can find, trying to get a layer that actually is useful. It's always amazing when you remember that what you're doing here is going down through the history of the sea floor in one tiny little area. So we're just looking at that size of sea floor and looking at what you see on it. So you would only ever expect to find the most abundant things that were alive because you're just looking at such a tiny area for the most part. I mean, even if you're looking at several square meters, that's nothing. So in this case, we're just trying to get a feel for what the rock is like, what might be here, and whether this is actually the right place to look at all. Or whether we need to head downstream, where we know there was some interesting stuff. Because so far, I'm seeing nothing. Leave it with me, I'll get back to you. Well, I found a few things. So we do have a nice little collection here of some graptolites, some moderately nice ones, and quite interestingly, some of these I'm pretty certain are younger than the ones over there. And we know it's younger, but I mean recognisably younger. So these, I think, are late Silurian. I think we've got a couple of bits of a thing called Cetograptus, which has little spines on the ends of the thecae on the lower part of the colony. And we've got some slender things that are probably of the type that is used to define the earliest part of the Ludlow, which is late Silurian. So that's interesting. We've also got one little shell, a very poorly preserved bivalve probably. It's very hard to make out exactly what that is, but it seems to be there. And then there's this lovely little thing here that looks remarkably like a sponge, but really isn't, I'm sure. But I'm going to take it back anyway just to check under the microscope, because it's probably just a little bit of a fracture plane where fungus has got in and left little strands over the surface. And this is actually borne out when you look at it down the microscope. So you can see it's got this little fibre network going on, but it's not like a sponge network. These are little curved filaments, they're branching, they're crossing over each other. There's nothing three-dimensional about it. This is an array of fibres that have got into the rock and have colonised a tiny fracture surface within the sediment. And this is extraordinary. I mean, it really does look like a fossil. It looks like it should be, but it's not. And it's one of those things that you get used to as a paleontologist when you've seen them for a while. You know what to rule out, and this is one of those things. So I will wrap up this lot and we can move on somewhere else, because it's not very promising. What we're seeing here is purely graptolites, almost entirely graptolites. There's no obvious sign of benthos here, nothing living on the seafloor, and the graptolites are not common. I found down at this lower part there were a few bits and pieces, up here almost nothing. I've also looked up here and it's basically massive blue-grey siltstone without any laminations in even. It's really quite limited. So we came here, if you remember, looking for crinoids, and so far there's no sign of crinoids here at all. But where we found them before was further down that way, which will be, well, we'll have to work it out, but it should be lower down again. So I'll wrap these up and we can move on. People often assume when they're wrapping fossils that they're quite, robust things and you don't need to put much effort in. In fact, you really do. So these things need to be wrapped separately in tissue paper, rolled up and put in a box which will protect them from being crushed. So yeah, it's worth putting the effort in, because otherwise you get home to lots of broken fossils. Been there, done that, no point doing it again. Especially when you put in so much hard work in the sun. I mean, it's not as if anyone enjoys this much. Okay, so that's where we were just now, that little sort of set of outcrops under the trees, and we're now coming down here to this little line of crags there, and this is where the crinoid came from before. And you can see again by the way these beds are dipping that, assuming there's no faults here, those layers are underneath where we were looking at up there. They're dipping down into the ground, which means that they're probably not that different in age to the ones with the graptolites in that we looked at to start with, which is interesting. But we'll see what we can get out of this. So this is our little outcrop, and it's actually rather nice, I think you'll agree. There's a lot of rock here, we can get into the outcrop quite nicely, and hopefully we'll be able to find some more. So we know where the crinoid came from. It was just up about, where was it? Somewhere there. That's right. So that is crinoid territory. At least we found one. But one problem is that if you look at this outcrop in more detail, you can see that it's not quite as it should be. There are these lines going through it, which are not meant to be there. This structure down here is a fault plane, and just above it there's another one where you've got the beds going at an angle that they shouldn't be. These layers are truncated, the beds are going in at different angles, it's clearly cut off. And that means that this interval here, where we are looking for the crinoids, is between two curving fault planes. We have no idea how much those faults have moved. It might be that that layer with the crinoids, next to the little foxglove there, is actually a unique little interval, and the crinoids are only there, and they've been cut off by that fault above it, and also the one below it. So it may be that there's a very, very thin interval in which we can get crinoids, but you never know. I mean, this rock all looks fairly similar, and it's a sort of thing that you just have to spend some time hammering and seeing what comes out. So I think that's probably what we're going to do. So you can probably guess what I'm about to do. I'm going to find some of the right layers of rock and see what's in them. So far, nothing at all. Well, that was hard work. Absolutely nothing in the bit at the top where we found them before, not even a graptolite. I found the odd other tiny bit of ossicle, and then finally I found this. So this is not a complete crinoid. What you've got here is an array of disarticulating, if not totally disarticulated, not entirely disarticulated, bits of crinoid. It's an entire plane with several sort of streaks of bits of the skeleton, the columns especially, probably other bits as well, just sort of laid out like that. And so there are layers, very thin layers and very narrow layers, because this goes to there and then it stops. That is the same surface pretty much, but there's no crinoids. So there's basically a little lens, a little horizon, where there were crinoids living and where they disarticulated, and apparently, probably, most likely died here, because they are not totally scattered, they're not completely mixed. We've got here an array of bits of crinoid which look like they belong to the same crinoid. We've got little lengths of the column. We seem to have more or less the same species based on the shape of the column ossicles. Where the little discs that form the column join up, there's distinctive pattern of ridges on them, and this all seems to be the same. So that's probably one complete specimen or a cluster of them. And I can expose a little bit more, very delicately. And there, yes, you do see the edge of this array of ossicles. So it's a dense assemblage, but it's not quite intact. However, I can spend a bit more time looking at this layer and see if we can get any more, because I know exactly where it came from. So it really looks, unfortunately, like these crinoids are highly localised. That you're not going to find lots of them here unless you're extremely lucky, as I was when I turned up at the first outcrop, and the first bit that I hammered, the very first block, had some semi-articulated crinoids in. And sometimes that's just the way it works, that you expect to find lots of things here, and then you never see anything else. But it's really interesting because, although obviously we want lots of nice fossils, sometimes the story behind it is just as intriguing when you don't find them. Because the evidence that we have is of semi-articulated crinoids that seem to have disarticulated in situ, that we have them where they were living, where they've fallen apart on the sea floor, and they haven't been transported and buried in a mass flow. They may have been transported at some point, but then why would you get multiple ones together? And this is a pattern that we see over and over again in the Silurian of this area of Wales, that you get little isolated lenses where you get complete crinoids or semi-complete ones, but only very occasionally, and where you do, you often get multiple ones. So that looks as though it's a genuine pattern, that the crinoids were colonising the sea floor, but only very sporadically. And when they did, when the conditions were right or when the larvae settled, you can have a motorbike going past. You can have a little colony growing on the seafloor, which then doesn't get preserved beautifully, but does get preserved. But most of the time, they just weren't here. Most of the time this rock is pretty much barren grey siltstone, mudstone, little packets of sediments that are coming in with the seasons, with storms, with little slump events, but we see the seasonal lamination in it. Mostly this is quite quiet water. We do also get layers which are substantially thicker and don't seem to have much lamination in at all. And these are presumably packets of sediment that are just washed down the slope and fallen into deep water. But where they came from was also pretty much anaerobic. There's basically no life on the seafloor here, apart from, very occasionally, these little islands of crinoids. And I think that's actually a really interesting story. I'm not quite sure exactly what to make of it, but it's strange ecology. It was either a almost entirely hostile seafloor, which is basically barren, apart from the odd little pockets of sheep. Oh no, crinoids, sorry, yes, crinoids. Or there was something else strange going on with the environment that meant that crinoids could only colonise then, but other soft-bodied animals could cope quite happily. But we have evidence for that as well, because you remember those little laminations that we get so beautifully, preserving the apparently seasonal changes. Now those would have been burrowed away if there were little worms living in the sediment. The fact that we have these beautiful clear laminations means that they haven't been burrowed away, which means that the seafloor was probably anoxic. And that's about where we have to leave it, I think. It's part of this whole science is that you often don't get the answers you're hoping for, but you do get a better understanding, even if that understanding is incomplete and it doesn't show you what you really wanted to see. So we wanted beautiful, complete crinoids that we could write up and describe taxonomically. That, it turns out, is not going to happen here without a lot more work. And I dare say that if you were to destroy this entire outcrop and quarry it, then you would get layers where there were complete, beautiful crinoids. But it would be a lot of work. And right now, it's a lot of work that I don't have time for. Sorry about that. Someone else will have to do it instead. Any volunteers? Yeah, thought not. Bother, forgot the camera. Hello again. I just wanted to finish off a little bit in the lab because I think we've tied in this specimen of the loose ossicles with another species that we found at a different site. So let's have a look. Now, under the microscope, you can see very clearly that we have these rather nice ossicles with a ridged facet, so radially ridged facet. But one thing that's quite interesting is that these surfaces are quite concave on one side. So this one here is reasonably flat. As you can tell, there's not much difference in focal plane, whereas that one has a lot of difference in the focal plane. And you can see this very clearly when you've got both eyes down the microscope and you can use stereo vision, but I'm just trying to illustrate it for you there. So one side of these ossicles is actually quite concave and the other is flat. So it's kind of that shape in cross-section, which is a bit odd. And with those nice radial ridges, that's quite clear as well. The other thing is when you go around, and some areas of this slab are very much dominated by the columnals. But then you go to other places where you're not quite sure what's going on because the columnals aren't so clear. And instead, there's a lot of strange little lines. I have to zoom in a bit. And there's a lot of these sort of longitudinal, well, just simple straight lines with not much else going on. And it's difficult to make out the shape of individual ossicles even, but there's a whole mass of these little straight lines. And in some cases, I'm not sure if I'll be able to find any for you, but I'll do my best. you can see that these are sort of V-shaped things, like a folded piece of paper. Maybe they're a little bit, it's not very clear, but they are basically like that sort of structure. So they're straight on the side and we're seeing them lying that way or different angles, but it's basically an arrangement of basically a folded sheet, which is the sort of thing that you get in the arms of some crinoids, but is quite unusual. Now, we can, as I say, tie that in because there is another crinoid that we have in pretty much disarticulated state, but not totally disarticulated, where we have the same ossicles in the column. And we also have this weird arm mass where you don't see much in the way of normal brachial plates, which are sort of Pac-Man shaped things with a mouth cut out. But rather we've got a mass of these little folded ridges or folded sheets, which seems to be pinnules. So it was a mass of strange little plates which formed a very dense feeding array. And so we're fairly certain that that is what we're looking at. It's probably the same species as this, which is from almost the same age. It's from the very early late Silurian, from a site only about 2 miles away, so not far at all, and you'd expect there to be some continuity. And again, in this one from the other site, it's a unique specimen. It was disarticulating in situ. It's something which was decaying and collapsing on the seafloor. So again, it shows that there is this weird ecology where you get mostly barren seafloor communities. You have mostly barren seafloor. And then very occasionally there's a little isolated pocket where you get either one crinoid or a few crinoids, quite often of the same species. And in the case that we've got here, in this disarticulated array, there are ossicles of different sizes, which might be simply that the column gets narrow away from the body, and that explains it. Or it might be that there were individuals of different sizes living and dying together on the seafloor. And we still have the issue of the laminations showing that there isn't any burrowing going on. We're not seeing brachiopods, we're not seeing trilobites. We're just seeing these little tiny isolated pockets of crinoids living on the seafloor. It must have been quite a lonely life, you got to say. And I don't know quite what the explanation is. I mean, if I had a time machine, this is the sort of thing I'd want to go back to, actually, something where we've got a lot of evidence, where we think we've worked it out, and then go back and see see how far wrong we are. Because it's very difficult trying to establish what the reality was of a situation like this when you're dealing with fragmentary fossils. We don't see the soft-bodied organisms. There may have been a whole forest of soft-bodied benthic things that we're just not seeing. But from the evidence that we've got, it looks like they were tiny, lonely little outposts of crinoids, which very occasionally became established multi-generationally. So you have a layer building up to a quite extensive degree. And I think the most extensive we found is at a site called the Pales, which is quite a famous site around here, where again crinoids are rare, but they do occur. And if they're not attached to nautiloids, which is the common way of finding them, you get them in lenses. And the biggest lens we found there is about 3 meters across. It was just a tiny little thin layer cutting across the seafloor and then eventually disappearing. So there we are. We're slowly piecing together bits of the Silurian ecology around here. It's nothing like what you get on the carbonate platforms and the coral reefs. It's its own little world in the deep-ish sea. How deep was it? Some people have argued hundreds of meters, basin-type depths. I don't think that's right at all. Personally, I suspect this was much closer to being 50 meters. But again, direct evidence is lacking. And it's something that we're going to be building up with more and more details of the distributions of fossils, the ecology, the sedimentology, trying to work out what on earth was going on. But we have layers of sediment with similar sorts of ecology in terms of the crinoids, but then you get layers full of bits of algae. So that is an indicator that at least the shallow marine conditions which were supporting green algae were there relatively close by. Anyway, I think that's enough of that. The rain is apparently going to be coming in for a little while. We've had a bit of fieldwork at Castlebank, so there'll be something new for the members fairly soon. But aside from that, I think I'll go back to looking at papers and more theoretical stuff for a little bit. So it might even be time for some more sponges. Lucky you! I'll see you for that. Don't miss it.